Hello, this is Alan Murphy, the pastor of New Barn Christian Fellowship in Dartford, Kent, in England, and we have been looking at some Bible studies emphasizing the Hebrew words and seeing how we can glean information and spiritual truth from those words. Now, we're currently doing a study on the women of the Bible, and we've looked one session on Sarah and 3 sessions actually on Rachel. They are quite famous in the Bible, but today I wanted to look at a couple of ladies in the Bible who are not very famous at all, and it's one of those situations where you could read through the verse and read over their names and really not note that they're there at all. And I want to look at Exodus chapter 1. And I particularly like this concept of people who are not very well known still making an amazing impact, but being known of God, perhaps not being famous in the world, but God seeing perhaps the lesser impact or the lesser activity rather that these people have. And these 2 ladies are certainly in that lesser known category. So I'm going to read from Exodus chapter 1, and I'm going to start from verse 15, and it says, "The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" And the midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Okay, now you may not be very familiar with that passage. It's not a passage that's read very often. I think people tend to skip over to chapter 2, where it's about the life of Moses. But I want to look at this concept of being a midwife. Now, there's always in the Bible, there's the practical daily side of a job, in this case a midwife, but there is also a spiritual side to the job too. And when you read the Bible, there's certain verses, and I'll give them to you now, but I won't turn to them for lack of time. But in Isaiah chapter 26 verse 18, and it's speaking of the ineffectiveness of Israel's witness, really. And as a result, we read that we gave birth to wind. All right, so it's not a physical birth, it's a spiritual process of giving a spiritual birth, but actually there's nothing there. All right, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 8, speaking about the end times, it speaks about the birth pangs, all right, of situations that giving an indication that something's going to happen. And that's what birth pangs and birth pains are all about. And then in John chapter 3 and verse 8, it speaks about being born of the Spirit. So you can see just in those 3 instances, and there are more, that the concept of giving birth has a spiritual side to it. And therefore, the job of a midwife has a spiritual side to it. And I want to suggest right at the beginning that as we look at some of these words and some of the thoughts from this passage, that we ought to be looking for us to be spiritual midwives. to the Christians around us, and even to non-Christians. We perhaps encourage them to have that born-again experience, if you like. Okay, so it's legitimate to do that, to take a practical job, which we have today, but to see the spiritual side of that particular job. Now, the word for midwife, and this is our first Hebrew word, is yalad. Yalad. Okay, oops, there it is. Yalad. And it means to bear young, to bring forth, or to carve. C-A-L-V-E, not C-A-R-V-E, to carve. All right, so you can see from these meanings, yalad, which means midwife, is that is their job. Their job is to help mothers to bear young. Their job is to help mothers to bring forth, all right, and to carve. All right, so that is their job, to be, I hope you got the meanings of those words, all right, that is their job, to be there, be present actually before the birth, but during the birth and after the birth. So that's the very essence of Shiphrah and Puah's ministry, to be midwives, to be bringing all these mums through this traumatic experience. And as I said earlier on, I believe the spiritual lesson for you and for me is to understand what the midwife's role is, and to see that God calls you and me to be midwives to each other, spiritually speaking. Now, we could say, well, that's just another term for discipleship, and that's okay, that it's a similar term to discipleship, because whether we call it discipleship or whether we call it midwifery, the fact is that there is I mean, we do think in terms of discipleship as discipling new Christians, but midwifery is talking about bringing and helping and assisting women during their pregnancy and at the point of delivery and afterwards. So there's a before, there's an instant, and there's an afterwards. And so when we're thinking about our discipleship, we are thinking in terms, aren't we, of the three processes. Not just when somebody becomes a Christian, we put them through an alpha course, and that means tick the box, they've been discipled. All right, we can be drawing, and we can be wooing, and we can be working and praying for people even before they become Christians. And the whole point of discipleship, of course, is that it's one who is a learner. So we are learning, and we're encouraging other people to learn too. So there is a development part of the process. We are abling, and the midwives are abling the mothers to develop before, at the point of birth, and of course afterwards, because they have to mature into the role of being a mother. I was watching a program recently about a particular battle that happened in the 15th century, and they had uncovered some remains of some of the soldiers who had been buried in a pit en masse, and they were trying to put all the bones together, and they were trying to work out, if they could, what role they had as a particular member of that army. And what they found was that most of the people in this particular ditch where they were buried were all archers. And the reason they said they were archers was that there was something about their body that was developed. And you will get that, whether it's somebody who's died and passed away or somebody who's currently living. When you are an archer and you're doing this sort of thing, okay, so I'm right-handed, if you can see me, this is my left hand, you're pulling the bow back, and the first point of development is and this is my right shoulder. It's the other way round to where you're seeing me, but this is my right shoulder, and I'm pulling it back, and by the very fact that I'm continuing to pull it back, it means that this part is going to be more developed than this part, all right, because there's a constant use. And with your left arm, which is used to hold out and be straight and hold the bow, and of course, if you know anything about archery, I've done a little bit of archery, but there are different poundages and resistance of the string. So you'll get a 40-pound bow or a 60-pound bow, and that's a measurement of the resistance. And the greater the resistance, the more difficult it is to pull the string back. And when you pull the string back, this arm, which is on my body, my left arm, it's my left arm, but it looks like the right arm as I'm looking in my camera, your forearm is developed, and it takes the strain of the weight of the bow. So it's developed, and as it develops, and anything that's developed becomes bigger and becomes stronger. So if we're talking about being midwives to other people, we are talking about helping them to develop, helping them to grow, and helping them to become stronger. And that's the first thing, I think, really, that we need to think about when we're looking at Shiphrah and Puah. And you look around, and I can't develop this too much because of time, but you look around and see in your circle of Christians, in your church, whether there are people who need you as a spiritual midwife. They need you to help them develop. Okay, I'll just leave that there. So that's the first word, yalad, and that's to be a midwife. Now the second and the third word I put on one sheet because these are the names of the midwives themselves. Now you've got Shiphrah up there. Shiphrah means to brightness, okay. It means embellish, and it means a ram's horn or a trumpet. Now, if we just very quickly look at some of these meanings, brightness. When something is bright, or if it has gone dull and you have polished it, can you see that you're adding something to the luster and the look, the brightness, the shininess of that particular object? You are adding something. You're putting back perhaps something that was lacking. The second one is embellish, which is like the same word as garnish. So if you're doing a meal and you want to put something on the plate, you might put a garnish on the plate. A garnish is something that embellishes. It makes it bigger. It makes it more interesting. Okay, you're embellishing or garnishing. And then the last one is the ram's horn or the trumpet. Now the reason it's the ram's horn and the trumpet, because the ram's horn is called a shofar. And you might be able to see that shofar is very near Shiphrah. They're the same root. Don't forget, if you take out the syllables, the vowels, you're taking out the I and you're taking out the A, and you've got Shiphrah. Shiphrah. I've taken out the I, I've taken out the A because there are no vowels in Hebrew. Okay, the Hebrew vowels are little marks underneath the word instead of a letter itself. So that's very much like the shofar, and it's a ram's horn or a trumpet. And I'll come to that just in a moment. Now, if you look at Puah, which is the other midwife, you've got to utter or to cry out. To utter or to cry out. So if we put these two words and these two meanings together, you've got the midwife Puah, who is crying out, and I would say they are crying out to God because of the difficult position they've been put in, and they're crying out to God on behalf of these Hebrew babies, and they're crying out to God so that he would bring brightness and growth and development in the nation of Israel, which was very much what the king did not want. And this aspect of the ram's horn and the trumpet, well, the trumpet is used for gathering people together. It's used in warfare. So whenever you are blowing a trumpet, whenever you are hearing a trumpet, some form of proclamation is being made. Now hear this. You want people to hear something, whether it's your own army or whether it's the opposing army, so that they can become afraid. But it's a proclamation. So what they're doing in their lives, because they have gone against Pharaoh, because they've gone against the king, and they actually feared God, it says that twice in the passage, they're spiritually speaking anyway, and it comes out physically and publicly, that they're making a proclamation. I know they say that it's because of the vigorous aspect of the Hebrew women, and they deliver a lot quicker than the Egyptian women, but actually that wasn't the case at all. They're making a proclamation that actually they're not going to kill these babies. They're going to let them live. And so Shiphrah and Puah together give us a sense of how we are to be with those who we are trying to give midwifery to, with those who we are trying to develop and bring on and encourage in their Christian lives. We're crying out to God for them, or hopefully we are, in prayer. And we're wanting them to succeed. We're wanting them to grow. We want them to be successful in God. And we make a proclamation. This is what I believe God is calling me to do in their lives. And I think it's right on occasion for us to commit ourselves to each other. Like David and Jonathan, their souls were knit together in love. We read in that passage in Samuel. They were totally committed to each other. And if only we could get this deeper meaning of how more committed we can be to each other, not by just saying, oh, I love you in the Lord, or just turning up at church and saying hello and having some fellowship, but in our active element each week, during the day, right the way through the week, not just in a church service, to be committed to somebody. And it's not just somebody who's young, could be somebody who's older. And it's not just somebody who's just given their life to Christ because they're a baby in Christ. It could be somebody who needs discipling and encouraging and teaching after 20 or 30 years. There are a lot of people around like that. They might be Christians, but they're not necessarily disciples. And that is the message of Puah and Shiphrah. And God is obviously doing a work here, because we have a king and we have a Pharaoh who wants to stifle the development of the people of God. He wants to stop the development, because we read in Exodus 1 and verse 12, it says, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. Okay, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. So what's happening is that the Pharaoh, he feels threatened. And he doesn't want them to be in control. He doesn't want them to be powerful. He wants to remain in authority. So the best way to do that is to keep them oppressed, to keep them down so that they don't produce, they don't develop. And, you know, during this pandemic that we've been going through since March of this year, so we're now in our, 9th month, you can look around the church, you can say, well, the church has been cut back, the church has been closed, we've had to cancel programs, we can't do anniversaries, we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't celebrate, we can't have meetings, we can't have social events. All that has been cut back, all that has been cancelled. But the fact is that the more, if you like, that there's an oppression and a closing and a heaviness on the church, that doesn't mean to say that God still doesn't work. Doesn't mean to say that God's been putting his feet up during the pandemic. Not at all. And you listen and you read about the amazing things that have happened in church life, in people's lives during this pandemic. You know, years ago, I read when I was a young Christian about this, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. The more you try and cancel out Christianity, the more it will grow. I mean, the devil doesn't understand that. He thinks, well, if we can cancel it out and eradicate it and all that. And we've said about Israel last week, the more you try and knock her off the face of the earth, the more God will raise her up and still become a beacon for the world to follow and for the world to learn by. And just personally speaking, and my brother Barry, if you're listening, Barry, hello, has been watching these YouTube talks since March. Now, for 50 years, which is how long I've been a Christian, Barry hasn't given his life to the Lord. And I know he won't mind me saying that. But on Tuesday of this week, he gave his life to Jesus. And he's, what is he, about 60, 68. So it's never too old or too young to come to Christ. And it's through the pandemic, it's through being able to listen to these YouTube talks and join us on Zoom and other situations, which has led him to come to Christ. And there was a lady at our church just recently, and she was doing some door knocking in the pandemic, keeping her distance. And there was a house which we had door knocked before, we'd put leaflets through before, when we had meetings on, inviting these people to come to the meetings. And this one particular house, and it was amazing how God does things, because this lady in our church, she was trying to put a leaflet through the letterbox. And today these letterboxes can be quite fierce in their closing mechanism because they're on a very strong spring. And if you get past the spring and the actual, letterbox thing itself, you come across this thick brush, don't you, which stops the, things being put in and the draft and all the rest of it. And she took ages trying to stuff this booklet through. And because she took such a long time, the lady came out and opened the door. She said, "Oh, hello." She said, "Oh, I recognise you." And the lady from our church said, "Oh, really?" And I don't think she had possibly even spoken to the lady ever before. But the lady just blurted out. She said, "Oh, when are you opening as a church? I really want to come. I must come. You must tell me when you are going to open." Now, in all the times we were open, the lady never came to church. Now we're closed, she wants to come to church. So the reason I say these things is because God is a God. You can't put him down. You can try and put him down. You can try and squash Jesus out of it. You can try and, blow him out and put him to one side. But actually, he's always going to be there and he's never going to go away. Now, whether that blesses you or not, it's up to you, particularly if you're not a Christian. But I just want to commend this person, Jesus, to you, because he is the one that as a midwife, a spiritual midwife, we are blowing the trumpet, blowing a proclamation, and we are causing these people to be brighter. We call it, there's a lot of sadness around at the moment, isn't there? There's a lot of dullness and all that sort of thing. And inside, you can be as bright as anything. And I just feel right this moment, I feel so positive about the current situation and the days to come. I really do. And I feel blessed to be a child of God. I really do. And there's nothing about Jesus that can surprise him. You know, he knows it all. He knows what's happening. And so this is an amazing time to be alive. And so with all the tricks of the trade that Pharaoh tried to bring in and the king tried to bring in, God put 2 God-fearing midwives. Now, obviously, some people say, well, you know, the amount of people, the amount of Hebrews who actually grew to the number that Moses led through the, you know, through the desert was some people feel it was a couple of million. There's no way that these midwives, 2 of them. So people are questioning the actual number of Hebrews that actually, you know, went through the desert. But I just think, I mean, these weren't just the only midwives. They might have been the chief of the midwives. But the fact is, the spotlight is on 2 women who feared God. And they feared God rather than man. And they did what God said rather than what man said. And, you know, it's so easy not to think of other people. It's so easy to think of ourselves, particularly when we're hurting or we're going through difficult times. And just be inspired by these 2 women who possibly before this talk you knew nothing about. You might not have even heard their name mentioned ever in your Christian life. But you have heard their name mentioned now. And their lives are an example to you and to me, whether we're man, woman, or child, it doesn't matter. The spiritual lessons are there for us all to see. So that's amazing what these 2 women are actually involved in and what they've decided to do. Now, the third point, which is a lovely point, and we'll just finish with this. We've got about 5 minutes or so left. In verse 21, I think it's lovely, and I'll read verse 21. It says, and because, I'll read verse 20. It says, so God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. There we have it again. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Now, the main word there in Hebrew is bet, which is house, Bethlehem, house of bread, okay? Bethphage, house of figs, etc., etc. This is, he gave them betim, gave them houses. But actually, another word is gave them families. And I just think that is lovely. Because can you see a consequence of their obedience in being a midwife and fearing God is that God honoured them. And there is this principle, isn't there, in Scripture? And I've just got a couple of references here. 1 Samuel 2:30 and Proverbs 11:25. And 1 Samuel 2:30 says, those who honour me, I will honour. Proverbs 11 verse 25 says, he who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. Can you see that there's a rebound effect here? And we're always, people say to me, oh, I'm really tired and I need refreshing and I need building up and all that sort of thing. And what they're thinking of is they're thinking of laying in a bath and having a long soak and all this, or going away on a holiday, or going away on a retreat. Now, I'm not saying that none of those things are important and shouldn't happen, but biblically speaking, what it's saying is that if you want to be refreshed, then refresh someone else. Okay, that's what the Bible says. If you want something to happen to you, then the best way for you to experience something is to give it away first. And it's the principle there, isn't it? Of it's better to give than to receive. But when we do give, we do receive. So we can't lose out. So, take your hands out your pockets and give financially to your church and give financially to other Christian organisations. Don't be tight, okay? Be generous, it says in Corinthians. Be generous. And then the Lord, who is a generous God, will pour his blessings down upon you, into your lap, mixed and shaken together and running over. In Malachi, I'll open the windows of heaven and pour out such a blessing that you will not be able to receive it. You and I, we have a bountiful God. We don't have a God who's affected by inflation or currency fluctuations, the price of gold, the price of copper, the price of metal, God isn't affected by any of that. Come on. He's always been rich and he always will be rich. And I'm not talking about money primarily. I'm talking about bigger than money. Whatever God has given to you, give it away. Because in giving away, God will bless you. I know he will. But we don't give in order to be blessed. We give, but we are blessed. And here, these midwives were blessed because of what they were able to give in their midwifery role. And the word here is the word increase, actually. Increase is rabah. Rabah. The word increase means to nourish, to increase, or to grow up. Okay? And that word comes across in the verse that we read, in verse 20. It says, so God was kind to the midwives and the people increased. The wives feared God and he gave them families of their own. Now, the indication here is that the midwives perhaps didn't have families. Okay, that's the indication there. So they're encouraging others to bring forth, and they haven't perhaps brought forth themselves. Some of them might have done, some of them haven't. But the indication is God saying that as a result of you giving yourselves to other people, I will bless you, and in a sense what you're giving will rebound back to you. It's the Ecclesiastes 11 principle of casting your bread upon the water. Okay, and I like to say if you cast your bread upon water, it will come back buttered. All right, so as we engage in this ministry of being a midwife, we can know a return increase because we are enabling others to go through the experience of increase. I just wanted to mention Henry VIII. It's someone that you've all heard of, and I'm quite interested in him and the whole Tudor period. And when Henry was getting older, obviously he was a fit young man. He could sing, he could recite poetry. He was a very good musician. He was a very good sportsman. He was really good at languages. There was nothing that Henry VIII couldn't do when he was young. Now, as he got older, he got bigger, as perhaps a lot of us do. And at one point, as he was really getting old, and I suppose coming to the end of his time, I think he was about 27 stone. He had a 56-inch waist. Now, he was increasing, most definitely, all right? His body was increasing. He ate constantly through the day. He would have so many meals, eat loads of meat and vegetables, and just it was a constant. And the more he increased physically, actually, the worse he got. And that's never God's intention, is it? Spiritually, for us, the more we increase, the more effective we become. But that wasn't the case with Henry VIII. The more he increased, physically that is, the less effective he became, because he was too indulgent. And so it really didn't do him any good, and he became more demanding, he became more cruel. And there was a picture that was painted of him in his last years, and I don't know if you've seen it. It's a very big, I don't know if it was painted by Hans Holbein, it might well have done, but it's a very, very majestic, authoritative figure of Henry VIII. And he had this painted because he was getting old, and because he felt he was losing his influence and he was losing his authority. In fact, he wasn't increasing, he was decreasing. And in the painting, the painter embellished, you know that word earlier on, garnished, embellished him. He made his legs longer than they were. And in this particular picture, he gives him really fat calf muscles, which makes him look very athletic. Now, the reality of it is that the painter wasn't painting Henry VIII as the picture depicted. The picture depicted a man standing up who was not exactly young, but was well developed and mature and glorious and jewels everywhere. But the reality of it was that Henry VIII was sitting down and his leg was up on a stool because it was ulcerated and he could hardly walk. He was actually walking with sticks at that particular time. And I just think that there's a spiritual lesson there. You know, it was a fake image of someone who actually was losing their prosperity. And the painter is trying to make something that it's not. He's trying to make someone appear what they are not. And for us, as we get older, yes, we might be a bit infirmed and things might not work as they used to, but our spiritual effectiveness does not have to wane. Your spirituality and my spirituality does not depend on whether you can run, whether you can walk, whether you can drive, whether you're as fit as you used to be. It doesn't depend on that. Because we know our bodies waste away with age. But our spirit does not have to. If you allow your spirit to go to sleep, if you allow yourself to become blunt in your life, then you will dwindle. And that's what will happen to you. But the fact is that if we are exercising what we should be as a midwife, God will bless us with increase, as he did the midwives. And I just love it. And it's almost an aside. The midwives feared God and he gave them families of their own. And I just want to leave you with that point, really. Would you like to be a midwife? We've looked at some of the things. You can look up what a midwife does and all that, but look, there are people in church who really need help. They really need support. Doesn't matter how long they've been a Christian. And there are people who you know who need your midwifery skills. They need you to cry out to God for them. They need you to walk with them. They need you to minister with them and encourage them. So can you be a spiritual midwife? The answer is yes. Do you want to be a spiritual midwife? Well, only you can answer that question. Now, I'm just 39 minutes, just coming up to 40 minutes now. So I'm going to stop there. And I trust you've been blessed by these two very women who nobody talks about, but God has had them in his sight. So the Lord bless you. Reread the story, go through it, and I'll see you next week for another exciting woman in the Bible. Shalom, and the Lord bless you.